all so much for coming. This is really exciting for me. If you hear my children eating Chipotle in the background, desperate times and solo parenting call for Chipotle measures. But I'm thrilled to be here, thrilled to be talking about this excellent, excellent new book from Matt. And I know Matt's gonna start us off by reading a bit, and then we'll get into a discussion. We'll open it up for Q&A, and maybe you'll go get some Chipotle after this to satiate both your mind and your body.
Thank you, Clint. Thank you, Rich, for that lovely introduction. Thank you, all of you, for being here, the DC Public Library. My kids are also here. They're somewhere. I'm not sure where they are. They're probably sliding down the slide over there or playing chess. But it's great to have everyone here. And as Clint said, I'm going to read a couple of small, short sections of the book. What I try to do in this book is to really frame the Black Hills of South Dakota and decentralize the sculpture of Mount Rushmore. And part of that story involves telling the story of the Lakota. So I'm going to read a short section, a little bit about how the Lakota view the Black Hills and how they view history. And then I'm going to move on to read a short passage about the actual sculptor of Mount Rushmore, a guy named Gunnson Borglum. From a Western perspective of history, archaeologists have found few traces of Lakota presence in the Black Hills before the early 18th century. The archaeological record of the region begins about 13,000 years ago, and much of what we know about human life in the Black Hills until recent times is inferred from archaeological evidence: projectiles, fragments of bone, teepee rings, grinding slabs, and pottery shards. Petroglyphs and pictograms are found throughout the Black Hills, created by those who belong to the many tribes who previously inhabited and traversed the region. But in a sense, none of that matters, because for many Lakota people, the Black Hills are simply the heart of everything that is, the center of their universe. Not just for vital resources like food, shelter, and medicine, the Black Hills have often been referred to as a Lakota food pack or supermarket, but an area imbued with sacredness, a land for vision quests and ceremonies. When the Lakota people arrived at the Black Hills in the 18th century then, they arrived home, and the Lakota emergence story, with Wind Cave at its center, is representative of the centrality of the Black Hills to the Lakota Nation, its political and spiritual heart. The Lakota way of recording and telling history differs from the Western way. The Western perspective, with history and a chronological description of reality, was not a dominant factor in any tribal conception of either time or history, wrote the great Lakota historian, scholar, and writer Vine Deloria Jr. From the time Europeans arrived on the shores of North America and completely altered the ecosystem and political order, notes, reports, maps, and books have been created to describe the land to which they arrived, the people they encountered, the events that occurred there, and the religious and political ideologies used to justify and accelerate the mass slaughter and territorial land grab that has taken place in North America since 1492. European and then American historical thinking is literate, the emphasis on easily mass-distributed text. This is not the case with the Lakota Nation, who instead have traditionally utilized oral history and winter counts to mark passing time. Winter counts are pictographs painted on large animal hides, usually buffalo, that depict the year just past, from the first snow of one winter to the first snow of the next. Many focus on one event that was important to the concluding year, a glorious success in battle or vicious defeat in battle, a plague of smallpox, a plentiful hunt. And these winter counts are specific to families. Memory is democratized and individualized. There is no singular dominant narrative, and a winter count can possess a century of moments on a single hide. They preserve and mark the passing years, but they are also narratively and emotionally rich in emphasis, thought, and artistry. Vine Deloria has said that they, quote, indicate the psychic life of the community, what was important to that group of people as a group. Combined with oral history and myth, they offer a version of the past that sings differently than typical American history. Scholars like to point to a winter count from 1775, 1776 from the band of the Oglala Lakota American horse, where the rawhide depicts a man carrying a species of tree, some see a ponderosa pine from the Black Hills, as evidence that this was the year the Lakota people arrived in the Paha Sapa. Though it is likely Lakota men and women visited the region decades before, the date has a poetic appeal given what transpired across the continent with the Declaration of Independence and the American Revolution, framing the story of two cultures and nations set on a collision course of history that is still unfolding today. The Finnish historian Pekka Hamalainen, the author of several histories of indigenous America, puts it succinctly. The great paradox of Lakota history is that by helping prevent the realization of other Wests, French, British, Spanish, Lakota inadvertently paved the way for an American West and eventually to their own downfall. So that's a little bit about Lakota and how they feel about the Black Hills. And I'm going to read a short section about the sculptor Gunnson Borglum, who came, his family were Mormon immigrants from Denmark. He was raised in the he was raised in Nebraska, then became an artist in the West Coast in Los Angeles. Since my first trip to Mount Rushmore, the presence of the Borglum Story Museum has been inescapable, both in billboard announcements and physical presence. I hadn't wanted to visit, however, until I can get a clear sense of Gunnson Borglum from my own reading and research. There are many Borglum stories, you see, and I wanted to learn as many as I could before being fed the one here at the Gunnson Borglum Museum in Keystone, South Dakota. Keystone is the small town that is closest to Mount Rushmore, for context. It is the only museum in the country devoted solely to Gunnson Borglum, and it is, unsurprisingly, a flattering portrait. He is compared to Leonardo da Vinci. In addition to omitting his involvement with the KKK, there is no mention of his temper or the conflicts it caused, no mention of the destroyed models of Stone Mountain, the firing of Rushmore superintendents, the screeds written to Doane Robinson, John Boland, or Peter Norbeck. According to this Borglum story, the Gunnson Borglum experience was one of patriotism and artistic genius, a poor boy born in the American West who created the greatest piece of political art in the United States. It was, in many ways, exactly the same portrayal as the audio tour at Mount Rushmore. The gallery at the end of the museum was my favorite part. There are few originals here, though many replicas and models of some of Gunnson Borglum's famous work hang from the walls and are pedestaled around the room. Borglum's artistic output spanned 50-plus years of creativity, a time that started without cars and ended at the dawn of World War II. The breadth of his work was astounding. He painted portraits and pastoral scenes, created monumental sculpture and smaller bas-reliefs like the one to honor Sacco and Vanzetti. Then, as now, there was nothing cool or avant-garde about Gunnson Borglum or his artwork. Cubism, surrealism, even modernism left him unaffected as he charged forward with classical heroic themes and realistic expression. In these ways, Borglum is not an artist I would naturally gravitate toward. There's too much packed in, not enough empty space to breathe and think and challenge. He had a point to make in much of his art, especially in the later periods, and you needed to accept that perspective. This is why his earliest periods of sculpture, when he was getting to know the form, is my favorite Borglum period. There is emotional complexity in the return of the boar, an opacity that mirrors the human condition better than the certainty of the granite portraits at Mount Rushmore, regardless of how classically beautiful those portraits may be. There have been many times over the course of this book when I have both sympathized with Borglum and become enraged by him. His motherless youth, subject to loneliness on the desolate Nebraska plains, is heartbreaking. I relate to Borglum both as a growing artist, the blossoming creative confidence when he teeters on the precipice of unlocking his potential before heading to Europe is a transcendent period of any artist's life, and as a struggling artist, full of self-doubt, worry, and existential angst, and wondering whether that bloom of youth will wilt before it matures. I admire his passion, his desire to push forward on projects and cut through bureaucracy, his clear love and devotion to his family. I understand his manic desire to fit everything in, the art and politics and community, grabbing at the sheer magnitude of life's possibilities. A fire burns that shouldn't be extinguished, his fights for justice, his defending the common man against corporations and government. This is what I admire about Gunther Borglum. But then there is the prejudice, the sense of entitlement, the clashes, the treatment of workers, the lack of subtlety in both his personality and his art, his prickly egotism that saw all errors a reflection of someone else's ineptitude, all successes a reflection of his own genius and foresight. Perhaps, though, this couldn't be any other way. The man who created our national memorial needs to be so complex, so imperfect, so riddled with the personal and ideational flaws and contradictions that have matched our own country for almost 250 years. I think, more than anything, what I do not understand about Gunther Borglum, what I cannot relate to, especially in a man so attuned to legacy and history, is his inability to transcend his times. The best artists operate on springboards, feet firmly planted in the present, ready to jump forward in style and ideas, pushing us as a humanity toward a new aesthetic and intellectual horizon. Gunther Borglum couldn't do that, and his work and his thoughts suffer because of it. Mount Rushmore suffers because of it. His inability to think about the Black Hills not as a staid artistic canvas, but as a breathing ecosystem imbued with meaning and history long before he stumbled upon the mountain in August 1925. It is this lack of historical transcendence in a sculpture meant to be where history marches along the skyline that will make its meaning contentious for as long as it or America exists. But this problem is not solely a Borglum problem. It is a national issue. Our inability to transcend our mnemonic traditions, to be locked like monuments into a past of our own creation. Meanings, though, like histories, evolve, and the shadows of Mount Rushmore adjust depending on where and how strong you shine the light. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that wonderful reading. Talk to me, let's start with the framing and the title of the book, right? You decided to orient the project as a biography of a mountain, which feels like a very intentional decision. Like you could have done a biography of Borglum, you could have done a biography or sort of a broader history of the Lakota, but you wanted to not only write a book about Mount Rushmore, but call it a biography of Mount Rushmore. What shaped that decision?
So there are two things. One is I wanted to think of the mountain as a person almost and sort of understand its backstory, who was influencing it, who it was influencing, how it came to be, what were the sort of historical forces that shaped it. So that allowed me to think about it as a biography. And I also felt that I had this epigraph at the beginning that from Emerson that says, you know, all biography is history in many ways, and all history is in some sort of sense is a biography. And so what can we learn about our history from a biography of a mountain? And so I wanted to tell that story as well through the use of biography. But there was also a broader idea that I had that I didn't want, and I mentioned this at the beginning, I didn't want to focus just on the sculpture itself, because there were a lot of books about how Mount Rushmore was created, the sculptor, and I wanted to tell a broader picture of the mountain itself and where it sits in the Black Hills of South Dakota, and tell that history, which I don't think is not quite adequately represented at Mount Rushmore, and not really quite understood, I don't think, by most Americans.
And when you began writing this book, it wasn't your first encounter with Mount Rushmore. You had visited Mount Rushmore before. Can you talk about your first time visiting Mount Rushmore, what the context of that was, and how that experience differed from the sort of later experiences of reporting the book out?
Yeah, so the first time I visited Mount Rushmore was before 9/11, and it was a very different time in American history. There was, we had just become victorious in the Cold War. The economy was booming. There was a real sense of optimism. And Mount Rushmore represented something that was solid in the United States. It was something where I, as a young man, could look at Mount Rushmore and actually feel twinges of pride and patriotism in who I was seeing and who I was. I was about ready to go join the Peace Corps in Mongolia. And so there was something about me that reflected, oh, this is, I'm American, And I think when I began to report this, that became a little bit more complicated. I began to see, especially the idea to start this project began when Donald Trump spoke at Mount Rushmore on July 3rd, 2020, and he offered a sort of narrow view of American history and the monuments and memorials that were being built to commemorate it. And I wanted to know why he gave that speech there. And so when I dug down deeper and researched, and then when I went to the Black Hills and spent a lot of time there, the memorial became much more complicated to me than it was when I first saw it those many years ago.
And was that complication the land upon which it was built, or the people whom were depicted by the mountain?
I think it was the land itself, but it was also honestly the emotions that people had tied to the land. I think one of the things that I learned I have 4 contemporary characters that I write about in this book. All 4 of them have pretty significant ties to Mount Rushmore. All 4 of them, 3 of the 4 have very significant familial ties to the area of the Black Hills. And what was so remarkable to me in just learning their stories is how emotionally charged those relationships are in ways that I do not have to any piece of land. I'm from Chicago. I feel very passionate about the Chicago Bears or sports teams. I live in DC. I feel passionate about DC, but not in the way that the people I was encountering in the Black Hills feel about their homes and their families and their stories. So that's really was one of the main complicating factors when I was reporting this.
And we were talking about this before we came on stage, this idea that in this work, but also in a lot of your work historically, like you are writing from the perspective of an outsider, right? That you are not of the culture, you are not of the group that you are often writing about. And I've been working on a book about World War II memory the last several years. And I've traveled to Korea, Japan, Germany, France, Argentina, all sorts of places all around the world within the United States, the Navajo Nation, spent time with survivors of internment camps in California. And so have had this experience, which is very different than my first book, which was about the history and memory of slavery. In this context, in the previous context, I am the descendant of enslaved people. I am engaged in a project that is both intellectual but also deeply personal, and that also in which there are sort of implications for lineage and family. But it's a different experience writing about a group that is not your own. There's a different way of approaching it. Inevitably, one's identity, one's positionality, one's history shapes the way that you approach it. And you're very, from the very beginning of the book, you talk about, like, look, I'm writing this as a non-native person. I'm writing this as a person who's not from South Dakota. And that is going to, of course, shape how I approach this. And so I'm curious if you can say a little bit more about how you thought about writing on this subject, and specifically writing about indigenous communities in the Lakota as someone who is not of that group, and if it just how it shaped your approach to both the reporting and the writing.
Yeah, I came at this subject, especially with the people I was meeting on the ground, I hope with a great sense of curiosity, first and foremost, and then also a great sense of humility. And I think one of the advantages that I had as an outsider writing about this sort of dovetails to what I was talking about just a moment ago, where there's not anyone who has any historical connection to the Black Hills. And by historical connection, I just even mean a generation, someone maybe that was just born there, that does not feel the weight of the fraught history of the Black Hills of South Dakota. Every family, every person I spoke to, that is very clear and apparent in some form or fashion. If you're a Native person, if you're Lakota, that oftentimes means experiencing racism, experiencing discrimination, experiencing disadvantages that are generationally in terms of economic disadvantages. If you are not Native, that means having to wrestle with what is becoming more and more apparent through historical findings, through demonstrations, through activism, sort of uncomfortable truths about the past. I didn't have to deal with any of that because I'm not from that area. So I could go in and talk to people and ask the kinds of questions that might seem silly or easy for people to answer or know that have lived there forever. But for me, were genuine questions of, I want to learn more. Can you tell me more about this? And so I think, and I've been told this by people who I spoke to, both on and off the record there, that in some ways, this has given me a good advantage to be able to sort of tell a story that many people there, may know, but that may feel uncomfortable telling themselves because the already built-in narratives that are there. And so I, as you said, like I have written about cultures different than my own in much of my work, and part of that is, just a genuine curiosity to sort of learn about people and about cultures and about history and about the places that, are very different from where I grew up.
Yeah, and one of the things I appreciate of many in this book is that that you are present, right? That you sort of lay out the historiography and you do the sort of deep archival research-based work to give us a sense of the sort of empirical reality of the mountain and the history. But you also, your voice is present, right? You also let us know moments in which you are curious, moments in which you are conflicted, moments in which you are, skeptical. And I think as a reader, it was helpful because in some ways you served as a guide, as a sort of stand-in for the reader in that way, but also because you foregrounded the book by saying my different experiences and identities shape the way that I'm coming into this. It becomes less of a, and I resonate with this because I feel very similar in my own work. It's less about it being like a definitive portrait, like this is the definitive portrait of Mount Rushmore, and it certainly is an authoritative account. But I think there's the sort of curiosity and humility that you discussed is also present in the text, where it's saying I am kind of on this journey to learn more about this place. Me coming to this subject is again sort of animated by that curiosity. And if a Lakota person who is the descendant, a sort of seventh generation Lakota who writes a similar book, inevitably that book is going to be different, right? Because they're bringing a set of different intergenerational realities and traumas and histories to the project in ways that would frame it differently. And I just think that your positionality and the way that you are honest about that. I was trained by sociologists in graduate school, so I'm always thinking about like how who we are shapes the people and the places that we encounter. And it was really, I think, effectively done in this context. Could you, a little bit separately, just to back up a bit, why was this built? Why was Mount Rushmore built? And how did they choose the 4 presidents who would be on the mountain?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'll answer that. But one of the reasons why I love your work is because of the way that you are on the page as a mind and character. And I think it's from when I was writing this book, How the Word Is Passed was very much in my mind in terms of how you were going about writing your book. Because I think, as nonfiction writers, as journalists, there's a real fuzzy line sometimes between where we are as people inserted into the text. And I think that there's, I value when a writer is very upfront about what they're doing, right, or at least trying to do, and less so when maybe there's distance or a lack of understanding how important that presence of the eye can be. But Rushmore was, and I think this is my favorite part of the story is many people, because of Mount Rushmore is very big, it's very monumental, it's very ambitious, kind of think that the federal government was behind it from the beginning. And it's not the case. The Mount Rushmore was started by a state historian, a dusty, tweedy state historian, a guy named Doane Robinson, who was very concerned about South Dakota's economy. He was a Renaissance man. He was interested in the kind of alfalfa that farmers grew, the kind of bridges that were built over the Missouri River, the design of the state flag. In the 1920s, he was very concerned about South Dakota's economy. It had tanked in the early 1920s. After World War I, there was a slump in commodities and agricultural prices across the Midwest, in particular in South Dakota, and Doane Robinson wanted to diversify the state's economy. So he said, what if we built a sculpture in the Black Hills that would attract these car tourists driving across the state to come visit these sculptures and then visit other cities and towns in the Black Hills? And there were many people who thought he was crazy. There were people like, this is, you're not going to be able to improve on God's beauty. Why would you interfere with the Black Hills? But he sort of went forth, and he had this idea that he wanted to sculpt figures of the American West into the Black Hills. So the Lakota leader Red Cloud, Lewis and Clark, Custer, Sacagawea. But when he hired Gunther Borglum to sculpt Mount Rushmore, Borglum brought with him a very different idea of what the memorial would come to stand for. He wanted to be more politically charged. He wanted to represent American empire and American expansion. And so because of that, he chose these four presidents, Washington, Lincoln, Jefferson, and Roosevelt, because they represented certain parts of that empire. So for Washington, it was the birth. For Jefferson, it was the expansion with the Louisiana Purchase. For Lincoln, it was the preservation and the saving of the United States with the Civil War. And Teddy Roosevelt was the unification. And that was primarily because of the opening of the Panama Canal. That rationale for having Teddy on there is a little bit of a stretch, but it was certainly one that was present in Borglum's mind. So that's why he chose those four presidents. And no one really gave him any pushback. Doane Robinson, at the time that Borglum was proposing these changes, he was just like, fine, I have the great Gunther Borglum here to work on this sculpture. You do whatever you want to do.
I was wondering about that because he was commissioned to do something very different. Like, it's like somebody asking you, it's like if you sold your book and were like, I'm going to write about, Mount Rushmore, and then you write a book about DC Public Library, right? and maybe it'll be a great book, but the person, I was wondering if the historian was like, wait a second, like, this is not what we agreed to, or if and it sounds like instead he was kind of like, whatever you want to do and deferred a lot.
He was very much in awe of Gunther Borglum. Gunther Borglum was a big personality. He was someone that came in. Always wore a Stetson and an ascot, and they kind of merged his two personalities as someone that was comfortable in the rugged American West and someone that was comfortable in salons, in Paris or New York City. And so he represented to Doane Robinson what would be possible with this sculpture. And I think he very quickly handed over sort of responsibility to what this would become to him. And in many ways, what's fascinating about Rushmore to me is that you don't build anything public like this anymore. It was a one-man show. There was no input from anyone. Even when the federal government funded the memorial, they did not offer suggestions. They sort of, they asked questions. They wondered, when this was going to be done. They sort of took over different parts of the memorial over the course of the time it took to construct, but they never really suggested other people to put on or other changes to be made.
In the current context, is it possible, logistically, for more faces to be added? We know that we have leadership who would love for their face to be probably plastered over the other four, but at least alongside those on, I don't think it's a coincidence that he gave a speech there, that he talks about the greatness of that space. Tell us, will there be a Trump face on Mount Rushmore or not?
Geologically, it's not possible to put a fifth face on there. There has been legislation introduced in the House of Representatives this year that calls for Trump to be included on Mount Rushmore. That legislation has not passed. Even if it has, or if it did, rather, most people think that the way the mountain is currently constructed, you could not put a face the same size as the four faces that are on there. I think that's an important caveat because, Donald Trump has wrecked the East Wing of the White House, right? So who's to say he would not want to as you said, plaster over the faces and put himself on there. You know, maybe take over Teddy Roosevelt's spot. I don't see him putting a smaller version of himself on there. I don't think that's going to happen. But I think most geologists say that it's not possible to put any other face on there right now.
And one of the things that you illuminate is something that I think is so true. And I was given an important reminder in your book was how historical sites, monuments, memorials, sites of memory aren't static, right? It is not the case necessarily that they are built and this is how they tell, the way that they told the story when they were built is the same story they tell now. And there are many places, you know, I write about in my book, Monticello, like how Monticello told the story of Thomas Jefferson 10, 20, 30, 50, 100 years ago is very different than how they tell the story about Jefferson now. To their credit, they get more information. They recognize that they weren't telling the story of enslaved people. They weren't telling the story of the Hemings family. They weren't even mentioning the name of Sally Hemings. They weren't talking about the fact that he enslaved his own children. You know, and so all of these sort of narratives present us with a fuller account, a more honest account of who Jefferson was. And I think in your book, part of what became clear to me was that there was the story that was told of Mount Rushmore when it was built. And then over time, that story has evolved and changed, but also not in a linear way, right? Like the story has, and part of it has been shaped by the leadership. And you talk about a guy named Gerard Baker. And I'd love for you to just briefly talk about him a little bit, because it was a reminder that part of what contributes to the evolution of a site or a site's desire to evolve or to tell a new story is the leadership of the site and who is in positions of shaping the narrative and what voices are included or not included there.
Yeah, this is such an important point because before I started this book, what you said about monuments being static, you know, I live in DC, we walk by monuments all the time, and you never really think twice about them. But when you think about them, you do realize that even though they are either carved into mountains or built of marble or granite or stone or concrete, that, yeah, actually they're not static, right? They do evolve as histories evolve, as we evolve. And I think that's really crucial to understanding how monuments function in today's landscape, right? With regards to Gerard Baker was the first Native American superintendent at Mount Rushmore, and he arrived in 2004. So for context, this is just a couple years after I first saw it. And when I first saw it, there was nothing at the memorial to indicate that Native peoples had lived, were living, are living in the Black Hills. And so Baker changed that, as he had at many other sites throughout the national park system. He had been superintendent at Little Bighorn. He had been superintendent at the Lewis and Clark National Trail. And what his priority was to introduce Native stories, Native themes, Native culture to the places that he was superintendent at. And he did that at Rushmore. So he built a Lakota Heritage Village to the left of Mount Rushmore. He invited cultural performers like hoop dancers to perform in the big auditorium at Mount Rushmore. He hired Native interpreters to tell the stories of the Lakota and other tribes who call the Black Hills home. And it really deepened the story of Mount Rushmore. And it also attracted a lot of people to go and hear those stories. I mean, Baker would tell me, and I would see from my own eyes from being there, that when it was time to tell a story at the Lakota Heritage Village and the drumming began, people's ears would perk up and they would want to go to where these stories were being told. And I think it's a real wonderful complication of the history of Mount Rushmore, and not even a complication of it, but just a full telling of the history of Mount Rushmore in ways that didn't exist, 25 years ago, that were very controversial when Baker introduced them to certain segments of the Black Hills population, but that ultimately I think are very important to how we view Rushmore and other memorials today.
And obviously, the thing is now that we are in a moment in which, again, our Trump and so many of the sort of MAGA ilk are pushing back against how we talk about history, right? They want to change. They think we talk about slavery too much in the Smithsonian. They think that we shouldn't focus on. They're trying to reconstitute the names of former Confederate leaders and the statues of Confederate leaders on buildings, military sites. And so we're in this moment of profound pushback to much of the progress that had previously been made in ways that are, we can attribute to the Black Lives Matter movement, but just I think more broadly, do you have a sense of the extent to which there has been pushback at Mount Rushmore in terms of how they are telling the story? Like, are they retreating at all in terms of talking about the Lakota, talking about indigenous people, talking about the complications and the histories of the people who are depicted there? Or are they sort of forging forward in spite of the sort of executive and federal energy that is trying to push all of us away from talking about things in their fullness and complexity?
That's a great question. So there was an executive order that was signed, I think in March, that said national parks should not disparage Americans and should tell stories that promote the patriotic elements to the national park system. At Rushmore itself, I was last there a few weeks ago, and the government was shut down. And so there was no, though you could see the faces, you cannot engage with any of the interpretive programming. So I don't know exactly what has changed there from when I finished writing this book. I do know that Rushmore is complicated, and that's run by the National Park Service. But there is an entity called the Mount Rushmore Society, which provides a ton of funding for the memorial to do programming. And the president of that memorial, who's one of the characters in my book, she has been behind and working with many different tribes who have called the Black Hills home for many years, new videos that visitors will see when they go to Mount Rushmore that is way more inclusive than the current ones are, that are way deeper in terms of the history than the current ones are. And so I don't have the sense that those are not going to be shown because of these executive orders. If they are not, that's a story in and of itself, right? But I don't get the sense that Rushmore is retreating. I do think it's still moving forward. And whether that's able to continue in this environment, I don't know, but that's the hope, I think, of the people that are running it right now.
Yeah. I want to make sure that you all have time to ask questions yourself. I don't know if we have, I think we have a microphone. So if you have a question, please raise your hand and we can come to you. Yep. You can also use mine.
When Rushmore was being built, was there any protests from the Lakota community or Native community? I guess just throughout the duration or at the start or anything like that?
Not during its inception and construction. There was a segment of Lakota leadership that wanted a monument built to honor Lakota leaders, much in the same way that Rushmore was being built to honor American leaders. And you see that reflected in the Crazy Horse Memorial that's being built in the Black Hills just a short distance away from Mount Rushmore. But there was no real protest at the time. No one really thought about whether Rushmore should be built in the Black Hills. It was more a question of could it be built. You begin to see protests of Rushmore as Native Americans gained in political activism, consciousness, and power. So you're talking about the first protests really at Mount Rushmore were in the late 1960s, early 1970s. And that has accelerated in the decades since. There's also, from a very early period, even before Rushmore was conceived by Doane Robinson, the Lakota did introduce to the American legal system court cases that was asking for compensation for the theft of the Black Hills. The Black Hills were taken by the United States in 1877 after the violation of the 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie. And the Supreme Court has affirmed lower court rulings that, in fact, the U.S. did illegally seize the Black Hills and has ordered the U.S. to pay over $100 million in compensation, which that was in 1980. That's ballooned to about $1 billion today. The Lakota don't want the money. They want the land back. And so that is, an important element to this story where though there was no protest at the time, that, that's one of the evolutions of the meaning of Mount Rushmore, right? That was not thought of in 1925 when it was first dedicated, but today is a crucial part to how the memorial is thought of and perceived, not just locally, but nationally.
Matt, I wonder, to me, in my kind of mental model of Mount Rushmore, that Mount Rushmore kind of straddles, is on the one hand very grand, magnificent, sweeping, and on the other hand has a little bit of a vibe of Americana, folk, roadside attraction. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about sort of what the original spirit was. I mean, you mentioned that this was meant to generate tourism for the state, but whether the spirit was meant to be sort of more one than the other and has drifted more sort of over time in the direction of roadside attraction relative to what hopes and expectations were?
Yeah, that's a great question, Steve. Thanks. I think if you read the newspaper articles from when the first dedication of Mount Rushmore in October 1925, there were grand, sweeping pronouncements about the importance of the memorial. I mean, the newspapers were, the local newspapers, like, this is the biggest moment in South Dakota history. So there was a sense of like real heft there, but there was also a real desire to have, the economic aspect of it work as well. That was what was being billed to local business people who they wanted to contribute money towards. If you contribute money towards this project, you'll see a return on your investment over time with the amount of people that are coming in. I think, so they've always been hand in hand, and I can't really separate where one was emphasized or not. I mean, today, I think what's interesting about Mount Rushmore, and this is something that I had to sort of tackle as a writer, I mean, my guess is that many of us don't really think about Mount Rushmore a whole lot. Or if we think about it, we think of it as kind of a kitschy kind of thing that is out there in the middle of the United States, and what really is complicated about it. And from that standpoint, the kitsch has sort of taken over, and we see that a lot. I have a Google alert for Mount Rushmore, and every morning I get dozens of newspaper stories about Mount Rushmore. Only one of them is usually about the memorial itself. The rest is about, who so-and-so thinks is on the Mount Rushmore of Clemson football players, or who the Mount Rushmore of, country singers are, or whatnot. And so from that standpoint, though it's become a shorthand for greatness, it's also really been cheapened, I think, in a way that Gunther Borglum would have hated. But the fact that over 2 million people a year visit it, the fact that it is sort of seen in some communities, MAGA in particular, as this, real reflection of American patriotism and strength, I think he would have really liked that. And I think that sort of is a little bit of the heft behind it. But certainly, how it is today, I do think most of us view it as, I mean, it's in our passports, right? So some of it has a little bit of feeling of these ideas of patriotism that it wants to evoke, but I think it also is, in the way that it's used today, does sort of make it a bit more kitschy and Americana-y than I think it was originally thought to be.
So many questions.
I just remembered while you were talking that I saw Mount Rushmore was #1 on a list of most disappointing, like had the lowest reviews of like tourists or as a tourist attraction. And I didn't really explore why, but I mean, you do have to kind of really want to go there to get there. Like, it's not really like popularly on the way to anything. And like, I also had a response of, well, okay, there it is. And when I saw it as a kid, it was just really hard to get me interested in it. Do you have any thoughts about why people get all the way out there and just are underwhelmed, I guess?
Well, that's a great question. I think if I were to answer for everybody, but I think my own sense of it is that it's so, the Black Hills are so beautiful The Black Hills are so distinctive. The drive to get to Mount Rushmore, as you say, it's not off the highway. You have to drive miles to get there. And you're driving miles through some of the most beautiful area of the United States. So when you get there, you've driven through this pine, you've seen this granite, maybe you've stumbled across some buffalo, and you get to this memorial that's up there on this mile-high peak of Harney Peak granite, and you're looking at it, and you're like, this is not nearly as beautiful as what's around me. So it's sort of overwhelmed by the natural beauty of the Black Hills. I think that's why a lot of people feel that way. I do think that, for the original conception of it, it's been kind of brilliant because you do have to go off the highway to see it. You do have to pass all these towns. You're going to stop in these towns. You're going to grab a beer. You're going to grab a cheeseburger. You're going to buy some memorabilia. You're going to do this. You're going to do that. And so from that standpoint, I think though people may be underwhelmed by what they see at the memorial, I think many people, I love the Black Hills. I love going back. I love being in there. I love going to the small towns. I love going to the old saloons. I love all that stuff, And so I think for the entire experience of the Black Hills, I would be curious to know how people rate that experience versus just visiting Mount Rushmore.
Let's do two more.
So, George Custer, what role does George Custer play in your narrative?
That is my father asking the question. Happy birthday, Dad, by the way. Custer plays a very important role in the narrative. Custer is twofoldly important. First, in 1874, he led an expedition to the Black Hills in which they found gold, and finding gold in the hills in that year was transformative for the hills. Before that, no American was able to enter the Black Hills. It was illegal. When they found gold, the president, Ulysses S. Grant, said, we can't prevent people from coming into the Black Hills anymore. They're going to want to come in, get gold. And so Grant then switched his policies for making sure all the Native Americans were on reservations. And those that did not would be, quote unquote, rounded up. And Custer was part of the rounding up. He went out to go fight Native Americans and famously met thousands at the Battle of Little Bighorn in Montana, where he fought Lakota and Northern Cheyenne. Custer, of course, was soundly defeated, killed. When word got back east that he was defeated, the U.S. was enraged and took over the hills. And so that's how the hills became in American hands. So Custer is vital to the story. I think the Black Hills would have eventually come into American hands, but Custer was the sort of spark that made it conflagrate.
Yes, maybe this is a good way to end it with this question, being that it's a biography. How did the mountain get its name? How did it become Rushmore? Because you really struck me when you said, the Rushmore. Everybody uses that cliche, as you say, but how did it get that name?
Yeah, this is another one of my favorite parts of the story. I call this the cheapest naming rights in American history. Charles Rushmore was a New York City lawyer who was in the Black Hills in the 1880s representing tin mine corporations. And he was on a horse with two guides. They were traipsing through the Black Hills. They stumbled across this mountain, and Charles Rushmore said to the guides, "What is this mountain called?" And of course, it had a name. The Native Americans had names for it, but the guide said it doesn't have a name. Let's name it Rushmore, and the name stuck. And so decades later, when they're beginning this project on Mount Rushmore, Doane Robinson, the state historian, calls an elderly Charles Rushmore in New York City and says, "Charles, we have this project. We're doing this. We have your name as Mount Rushmore. Can you donate money to the cause?" He's like, "Sure, I'll give you $5,000. So for $5,000, Mount Rushmore became Mount Rushmore.
Everybody, please give Matt a huge round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you, Clint, for
course.
being in conversation.
I should also say, I'm looking at all of you, and I've counted how many of you there are here. Mom and dad and wife aren't included. Please don't be a person who comes to the book talk and doesn't buy the book. Some of you get the book for free. That's great. If you have the means, please support Matt. Please support Solid State. These events can only happen if you buy the books that then sustain the bookstores that allow for these wonderful conversations to happen. So buy one for yourself. Christmas is coming. Buy a few for your relatives. And thank you all for coming out. It's been wonderful.
Thank you.